Welcome to CP142, Migrating a Big Data Environment to the Cloud, the Untold Story. My name is Sasha Kippervarg. I'm the head of cloud operations for LiveRamp, and I'm here with Ben Podgorski, one of our more senior software engineers, and Patrick Raymond, who's our senior product manager, and he owns the infrastructure portfolio. I think you're all familiar with Dory. I won't go over that. So a little bit about LiveRamp before we get into the meat of the presentation. We essentially take offline data, addresses, other PII, basically, and then we de-identify it, we transform it, and then we make it available to our channel partners who all then advertise to you. Ben is going to get into the technical details of what our company does in one of his topics. So the first thing I'd like to say is that Ben and I and Patrick are really a small group of the folks responsible for the migration. It's a team of teams. We have a huge infrastructure platoon, a large engineering team, security professionals, finance professionals, compliance professionals, and they were all responsible for getting us migrated. We're mid-flight right now. We should be done shortly. I also happen to have members of the Google team here on this slide, and that's because they are part of our team. We treat them as such, and they help us out as such, and they are part of our team of teams. So when I first joined LiveRamp and I was asked to migrate the company to the cloud, I had no idea what that actually meant, and that's because this is something that happens maybe once in 20 years or once in a lifetime, and there really isn't a playbook for doing that. And I figured, you know, every adventure should start with a single step, and that's what I did. I just started asking questions. I wanted to find out if the executives are aligned. I wanted to find out if there was a budget. I wanted to find out what the approval process was. And quite often those questions led to more questions. And, you know, that's the approach I took. I think many of you in the audience are also undergoing similar challenges. Maybe that's why you're here today. And when I started to think about the approach I would take, I thought about my favorite artist. It's a guy named the Aphex Twin, Richard James. And this is a cool quote where he talks about how he creates music. And essentially what he says here is that he throws out the playbook. He feels his way through the dark to what he wants to learn, and he adapts his approach. And I think many of you have your own gardens that you till. They're unique, you have got your own problems, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all playbook that addresses all of that. The first thing I discovered was that we needed to get the team right, and that meant having the right skill sets, that meant having the right culture, and I would describe what we had before was an operations team that was attached to engineering. They were a very skilled group of systems developers for the most part. Sorry, not system developers, sysadmins for the most part. And they were trying to do their best, but they really weren't integrated into engineering in the way that I felt was necessary for us to get to where we needed to go. And so we adjusted the team. We adopted Scrum first. Some of the sysadmins left the team. Some of the sysadmins on the team grew new skill sets. We hired system engineers. We poached from other teams within LiveRamp engineering as well. And we essentially became a development team focused on infrastructure. The next part of the challenge was trying to figure out security and governance. Now, in order to get to the cloud, you have to get approvals. You have to go to security, you have to go to compliance, you have to go to legal, and, you know, surprise, surprise, none of that process existed as well because, of course, nobody does this, maybe once in a lifetime. And so we had to create that process. We had to establish the relationships. We had to come up with a way to work with security where they could review everything we were doing on a week-by-week basis, where it was tracked like in a JIRA ticket, and then, you know, we would get the sign-offs and then proceed. That was quite difficult to do. It took about 12 months. I am proud to say that we have a fantastic relationship with security and the other governance teams today, some of whom are in the audience. The next challenge was sort of trying to think how we should approach the migration. And I felt strongly that we should treat it like a product. And what that meant was having a product manager who understood infrastructure, who approached it from the product perspective, who thought holistically about how we should do it, how we should communicate about it, And that's when Patrick, who's going to be talking in more depth about this, was brought on. He changed his focus from security and governance to product management, and he took care of most of that. One of the most important decisions that we made during the course of migration, before we started the execution, was trying to figure out what cloud we should use. Probably many of you are familiar with AWS. They're sort of a 900-pound gorilla. And 2 years ago, when we first started, our company was also heading down the AWS path. And we were within probably a month of signing the contract with AWS. And we had looked at GCP before in a sort of a light fashion. We even had some of our teams using GCP on the East Coast. But everyone assumed that the decision was actually made and that there wasn't another possibility, myself included. And I got an email from Warren Jensen, who's our CFO, and he said, did we look at GCP? Because we were really close to signing like a multi-million dollar deal. And I answered back quickly, yes, but then after I sent it that night, I felt uncomfortable with my answer. I didn't feel like I could properly represent to him in a detailed conversation why we were choosing AWS and why we hadn't reviewed GCP in detail. And so the following morning, I came in, I brought all the senior technical teams together on infrastructure, and I asked them the same question. And I think I got back the same response that I felt myself, which is that we hadn't looked at the data recently. And you all know that the cloud moves really quickly. New products are developed and delivered quickly, and we hadn't looked at it in the last 6 months. And so we agreed to take a week out, take a look at the new feature set, figure out how it mapped to what we wanted for our company. And when we came back after that week, we all realized that there was something there and that it needed more investigation. And so then we set off for another 3 or 4 weeks to deep dive into Kubernetes, the big data stack, cost, all the dimensions, and we focused on that. And what we discovered was that GCP was a far better solution for our company across all of the dimensions, cost included. And so, I call this, the fallacy of sunk cost, which is that we made this huge investment in AWS, and we had proceeding down that front for a really long time. And it's true, we had wasted many, many hours going down that path, but that didn't mean we couldn't change our mind. So once we made the decision for GCP, we had another challenge, which is that we have a small engineering team and a small infrastructure team, relatively speaking. There aren't thousands of us, but who's going to manage our existing data center? We're co-located here in San Francisco. We've got about 3,000 servers, 100 petabytes of Hadoop, lots of VMware stuff. We wanted our development team to focus on our future and not our past or our present. And so what we decided to do was go out there and try to find a company that could do that for us, that could take on that full workload while we focused on the future. And we found a company called Sirius, Michael Porter and Scott Wright. I think they're here somewhere in the audience too. They sort of sold us on this vision. And in fact, over the last month, they've taken on the full workload of our data center and are helping us out while the rest of our team focuses on GCP. Once we solved that problem, there were still 2 other things that we needed to work out. 2 things that could sink us and could likely sink your ships too. And one was cost tracking, and the other one was governance decisions. In terms of cost tracking, we have this philosophy that we want each of our development teams to do for self, right? We want them to be able to spin up their environments quickly on their own without asking anyone. But of course, that meant if they did that, then they could spin up environments entirely on their own, and they could spin up millions and millions of dollars of resources without anyone being aware of it, and then sinking our budget. And so we decided to spin up a team and another PM to focus on that particular issue, and that effort is bearing fruit right now. We feel like we have a right balance of giving developers freedom, but at the same time having alerts and relationships with finance directly from those teams where those challenges are addressed. The governance thing was quite interesting. We had learned an important lesson from 12 months of going back and forth with security previously on the approvals, that even if you can go fast in the cloud, even if you can deploy something instantly, it doesn't mean that you have the approval to actually get your product out the door quickly. And so without having fast governance decisions, really doesn't matter. And so we spun up another team within engineering. We hired a compliance person, his name is Debroop, and we created a process that we call CAKE that basically ties together decision making from all the governance teams through this CAKE process. And we've gone from something like 12 months to 2 weeks for making a decision to allow products into production. So in terms of major lessons learned, what I can share with you, what I'd like you to think about for yourselves is, number one, migrations are this giant multi-dimensional beast. They are the very best and most challenging of problems. If that's what you like to do, then you're certainly in the right place. I would say get your team right first and ask enough questions till you understand the problem fully. Do not use a playbook. Assume nothing. Reevaluate your data and new data constantly. And be aware of the fallacy of sunk cost and how it affects your decision making. Don't be afraid of changing processes or hiring for new roles in the process. You will likely need to, because this is something quite different. And finally, don't be afraid of being wrong. You will make mistakes. Try to get to the truth of something rather than being right. Iterate your way to success. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Ben now, who will tell you about the problem from the engineering perspective.
Hey, I'm Ben Podgorski. I'm the engineer. I work on a data infrastructure team, and I'm going to talk about our migration to GCP from the perspective of a software engineer. I want to start with just emphasizing I'm not claiming to be a chief architect on this process. This took dozens of engineers, years, but they're all really busy actually doing the migration today, and I'm the one talking. It's hard to describe the migration without briefly describing what LiveRamp sells and how we do it. The mile-high view is we take customer data sets, we take identifier data, and we deliver this to the ad tech ecosystem in 2 ways. First, with a batch delivery system, and also with a real-time key value delivery system. I'll talk more about our environment later, but the short version is that most of this processing happens on a large Cloudera Hadoop cluster in our data center. Most of our other applications ran on VMware virtual machines provisioned by Chef, although we did have a smaller CoreOS Tectonic cluster. And our real-time key value serving was with a homegrown system, open source system we built. I want to emphasize one thing about our Hadoop pipeline. For a lot of companies, Hadoop is value add. They have a product, they sell the product, they get logs out of the product, and then they do machine learning and get some value out of it. That's not what LiveRamp does. We're basically an ETL company as a service. And if we don't move data through our Hadoop pipeline, we really don't sell much of a product. So that made the migration very challenging, which I'll talk more about later. So as of last year, this all happened in our on-premise data center. The bulk of our hardware is our 2,500 node Cloudera Hadoop cluster. There are larger clusters out there, but it's pretty sizable. 90,000 CPUs, like Sasha said, about 100 petabytes of raw storage. Any non-Hadoop work happened on our VMware cluster, about 500 plus VMs. A lot of these were just dedicated to launching jobs against the Hadoop environment. About 8 terabytes of data in and out each day, counting very roughly after compression and filtering and sorting, all of that stuff. So at the end of the day, it was a pretty significant hardware environment that we needed to move. I'm not going to talk about what convinced us to move to the cloud. Sasha has covered some of that. The reasons you'll hear at 1,000 other talks and breakout sessions this week. We wanted to move fast. Our engineers wanted to be developers, not historical reenactors. We needed to scale. We needed cloud-native tools, the usual reasons. Likewise, I'm not going to spend a ton of time convincing you to choose GCP, because that's why you're here. But I wanted to talk about the decision process that we made. Obviously, we care about technology. GKE was a major draw. At the time, AWS didn't have a good Kubernetes offering, and we didn't really find the third-party offerings compelling. Our real-time delivery team found the networking to be superior to any of the other offerings. We needed object storage. GCS was competitive with anything else out there. Price was good. They got a better price than any of the other we got a better price than from anybody else. But the thing I wanted to emphasize is it was the people that really made this choice for us. When we talked to Google, we talked to engineers who wanted to solve our problems. We didn't feel that the whole goal was to sell us professional support hours. Not that there's anything wrong with professional support, it's great, but we wanted, we were talking to people who fundamentally wanted to answer our problems and help us. And it gave us confidence that throughout the whole migration, they would be there, side by side, helping us through the problems. And that's absolutely stayed throughout this process. So when we decided we were doing this for real, we sort of broke it down into a few questions. What is our day one architecture? What is the minimum viable cloud architecture for LiveRamp? How do we get there? Building in the cloud, I'm not going to say it's easy, but you get to start fresh. You get to start on cloud-native technology. If the company's not running, it's not a huge deal. But that's not true for us. We had a large amount of infrastructure and process we need to keep running while we migrated. And last, what do we want to build towards? We accept that our infrastructure isn't going to be perfect on day one. It's not going to be fully cloud-native on day one. But we want to set ourselves up for success down the road. So what was the infrastructure going to look like on day one? Asking a development team to migrate is hard, and asking them to re-engineer while they do it adds a ton of uncertainty into the process. It's not super sexy to say at a conference like Next, but where there weren't drop-in replacements and direct translations of our infrastructure to GCP, we generally erred on the side of lift and shifting what we had into GCP. That said, some of the offerings were compelling enough and provided a pretty straightforward translation that we felt it was appropriate to switch while migrating. So I'm going to talk through what did and did not change. So what did not change? Our on-premise environment had a single logical internal network. Internal services communicated via private IPs, mostly orchestrated through a console. We felt it was critical to keep this the same for app teams. They needed a single network. The apps needed to talk to each other over that network. And I'll talk more later, especially across the bridge between our networks. All our big data processing happens on Cloudera Hadoop. That's not changing. I don't want to talk to the security and privacy decisions very much, but it's important to note they were a huge part of what we did. The cloud empowers developers, but it also makes it easy to make highly available, globally distributed security breaches accidentally. So our ops team remains in control of firewall rules in terms of permissioning, because fundamentally, if we're not keeping customer data secure, we don't really have much of a product. So what did we change? On-premise, we stored pretty much all of our data on HDFS. So our HDFS was actually a pretty well-oiled machine by the time we attempted this migration, but it was very stressful and difficult to maintain, knowing that every upgrade was an opportunity for data loss or some sort of catastrophe. As our company grew and as we got more customers and shorter SLAs, it became harder and harder to upgrade our environment because the product team didn't want a day of downtime when things went wrong. So we basically eventually just got stuck not being able to upgrade. So we use, once we're on GCP, we use GCS for all persistent data storage. We don't use HDFS for any persistent data. On-premise, we use Chef to provision all of our VMs. We had a lot of application logic built into Chef. And we actually at first tried to transition Chef into the cloud. It didn't work well, and we felt that GKE was a great product. Some of our teams have been using GKE, and they felt it was appropriate to switch all of our VMs over to GKE as we migrated. Last but not least, we decided that Google Bigtable was a great replacement for our homegrown key-value data store, and we'll be using that for all of our real-time web traffic. So I personally spent most of my time translating our Hadoop cluster to GCP, so I wanted to take a minute, not as much to describe the architecture, which could also be a whole talk, but to talk about the value and how liberating it is being in the cloud. When you have 2,500 servers, that's what you have to work with. They have all your data. If you want to test out an upgrade, you can't buy 2,500 servers for a weekend, do a scale test, and then spin it back down. You need to test on what you have. You can set up dev clusters, you can set up staging clusters, but you can't really do scale testing. So on GCP, if you're using GCE VMs, that's not true. You can spin up the infrastructure. You don't have to spin down the old infrastructure first, test it out, and the rollback is easy. And it's even easier because it's all on GCS. So this is really quadrupled our ability to iterate on this infrastructure, and it's turned maintaining this environment from something stressful and painful into something that's actually fun again. So this is great. but how are we getting to GCP? There are a few different migration strategies. If customers don't, or if companies don't have a lot of customers, and if they don't make money, you can just turn yourself off. You can use a transfer device. You can ship it, across the country, and then you turn it back on again in a few weeks when everything works. We checked with our sales team, and we have customers, and we make money, and they were not happy about the idea of turning off. So that left us the option of a slow, sort of very carefully orchestrated migration process. So we started with what we knew we needed. At least during the migration process, we needed a single logical network between GCP and our data center. Teams needed to be able to spin up services in GCP, which communicated back to the on-premise data center. Likewise, they needed to be able to share database calls. So to avoid dumping the entire company in one big network, we split into a shared VPC network. Teams got their own subnetworks, and they could spin up services within them. Teams could communicate with other teams on GCP, as well as back to the data center. We did this with a cloud interconnect, and this was really critical. I think it's important to emphasize that we had production applications on GCP from the beginning. We didn't have to set up a staging environment and then cut over the company in one day. We had services from a week in running on GCP in production. So this explores one of our core challenges as a company, dealing with the limited egress we had from our data center to GCP. Internal to our data center, it's a big data center, we have tons of bandwidth, but we never optimized to be able to get all this data out of the data center. We were limited at the end of the day to about 50 gigabits to GCP. Obviously, we could have re-architected this. We could have built a larger connection, but we didn't want to spend millions of dollars upgrading a data center as we were trying to turn it off, just to keep that for 6 months or so. The reason transfer devices didn't work well for us is only a very small portion of the data LiveRamp processes is actually cold data. We're constantly getting imports from customers. We're constantly getting refreshes of our data from our data sources. We can't really take days to transfer that data over to GCP and restart the processing. The other thing that we had to keep in mind is that data egress from the cloud is very, very expensive. Cloud providers, and not just Google, but they're all sort of drug dealers. Ingress is totally free, right? Put all your data there, it's great. But if you ever want to pull terabytes of data out, it becomes very expensive, especially if it's part of your normal day-to-day processing pipeline. So 50 gigabits, and you might say 50 gigabits, that's great. That sounds like more than enough for anybody. And it is for our input data. We get 10 terabytes of data in of matches and customer data and stuff, and we don't deliver more than 10 terabytes, 10 terabytes a day out to customers. But because of the nature of what we do, we have huge distributed joins happening in the middle of our data processing pipeline. We're reading and writing 500 terabytes a day. And it's very easy for teams, if we cut this connection in the wrong place, to totally saturate the interconnect. This is a complicated problem. We could fill a whole talk with it, but the short version is we built an internal service which copies data in a prioritized fashion for teams. Teams were free to use the interconnect for service and database calls, but the data infrastructure team handled all file copies. We asked them to submit those, to this service. This let us prioritize production data transfer that had short SLAs, stuff that was on, stuff that we promised to, deliver to customers within a very short timeline. The cold data transfers we could sort of deprioritize, and they would happen eventually. Really critically also, this gave us insight into who was using our bandwidth at any given time. So if teams were just copying files directly, you'd have to muck around this TCP dump to figure out who was using the interconnect at 2 a.m. last night, and that's why everything failed. Instead, we can just look at our Datadog dashboard and say app X was using X, Y, Z of the bandwidth at 2 a.m. These constraints sort of dictated the overall structure of our data migration. We started at the tail end of our pipeline. We'd migrate an application. Instead of them pulling data directly off of HDFS, they would call to the infrastructure data replicator service, which would handle copying the inputs from HDFS back to GCS. And then it would consume them just like usual. Once the upstream application migrated, we wouldn't need to do the replication anymore. The data would exist natively on GCS, and we'd continue through that process, tailed ahead of our processing pipeline, and that's where we are right now as a company, about halfway through that. There's a lot more fiddling here to make sure that we still weren't saturating the connection, but this is the overall structure of how we migrated. So that's a highly abridged version of how we're getting to GCP. The last and most interesting question is, what comes next? How are we going to re-engineer things to actually work cloud natively? And I'm going to cop out and tell you we don't actually have a strong answer to that question yet. It will involve at least a bit of Bigtable for real-time queries. It will involve a fair amount of, Bigtable for real-time queries. It'll involve a fair amount of BigQuery for ad hoc queries, data flow for lightweight data transformations. But the main reason is, I don't know, is because it's going to be developer-driven. Our goal is for the infrastructure team to be not making these decisions anymore. The infrastructure will assist, infrastructure will build tools for people, but at the end of the day, being in the cloud means developers can provision the infrastructure they need when they need it, as they feel appropriate. So the goal is, in next year, hopefully, some application team will be up here talking about how they took some 6-hour batch pipeline, turned it into a 60-second BigQuery application or Bigtable script or something. But I can't tell you that because we're not quite there yet. So yeah, that's all I've got. I'm going to turn things back to Patrick. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, thank you. My name is Patrick Raymond. I'm the product manager for the infrastructure platoon at LiveRamp. And I want to talk to you about this migration. As Sasha mentioned, we wanted to think about this a little bit differently than maybe a PMO or a project management specific thing, and think about it like a product itself. So you've heard the theme from both Sasha and Ben that this is a huge and complicated problem, and things are going to change a lot, and so it can get a little bit confusing and it can be a bit overwhelming, and you can get to a point where you feel like you spend your life on the left side of this, and you're probably familiar with this design squiggle, but this is very analogous to our process. When we first started, all of our questions felt like the answers came out on the left here. But as we started to iterate with the teams, we realized that we weren't going to find a perfect answer to this question. And so we've noticed that as time has progressed, we have managed to move more towards the right, and things are starting to become a lot more clear. And so I think it's important to note that this will probably happen to you if this is something that your company is preparing to do. And so it's best to just jump in somewhere and start making decisions. Ben mentioned also that teams are making decisions about their own infrastructure, and so we wanted to also think about the distinction here that when you migrate from your data center to the cloud, sure, there's a lot of great tools available to you, but you're not going to solve every problem immediately, and like you heard, some of the things that we're doing are just pure lift and shift, and so it's important for us to not promise all of our stakeholders that as soon as you move to the cloud, all of your problems are solved, because it's not going to be the case. And we're not going to end up with a brand new company just by migrating. So we wanted to make sure that we scoped the problem correctly and that our stakeholders understood what we were scoping. So I want to talk a little bit now about how we thought about aligning our stakeholders around this idea. And the ways that we did this were by articulating the value that we were going to be providing. We wanted to also talk about the cost of not doing the work, and primarily the function in which we did this. So probably the overlying statement here is that everyone needs to deeply understand the work that you're trying to do, and you need to know who are your stakeholders. So probably a bit of a silly thing to do, but you can ask yourself a bunch of questions about who is consuming your infrastructure, who holds your budget, who is going to provide you, the security and compliance approvals that you need to operate in the cloud. And those are your stakeholders, and they all care about different things, and so it's important to align them in different ways. And so for our executive teams, we wanted to talk to them about how we could help them achieve their future goals, how we could help them increase their margins and move forward with company initiatives. Our developers wanted to understand how they could use this new infrastructure in better ways and captain their own ships and build their own products. And our product teams want insights into their products and want granular understanding of costs. And there's also, as I mentioned, the cost of not doing the work. For us, there were continued costs of an on-premise data center. There's a continued lack of granularity of our costs. And there's a more complicated and constrained product development process when working with our existing data center. And so as we socialized this and it became understood, we found out that, as Ben mentioned, people wanted us to keep making money. And so we needed to keep shipping product. So we needed to figure out how to prioritize all of these things that our stakeholders were aligned around. And just to give you an idea of the scale that we're talking about for prioritization, we have 22 teams in 5 countries, probably very similar to a lot of people in this room. And sustaining this type of prioritization across the globe for over a year is a very difficult thing to do, but it is possible. So this is a pretty obvious statement, but when everything is a priority, which for each of those teams it will be, then nothing can be prioritized. So we know that we need to keep shipping. We know that everybody's thing is the highest priority to them. And so then what do we do with that? How do we work with that? As Sasha mentioned, all of our teams use Scrum in some form or fashion, and one of the things that each of the teams do is they have business value meetings. And so as a product manager, I'm interested in attending all those business meetings and business value meetings and helping them understand the value of the work that we're going to be doing. I will come to the meetings and talk about the costs of the work, talk about the cost of not doing the work, and then also help the engineering teams understand what they could benefit from in the cloud. The biggest thing here is really to be present. It's a lot of meetings to attend, but you have to be there to make sure everybody understands the value. And then also, if you're there, you can talk about things like, not making promises that you can't keep, but talking about the great benefits of reduced OC time, increasing your iteration speed for new products, transparently exposing costs. And so something that an engineer said to me as I was making my rounds to all of these meetings was that you can't spend all your time devoted to the business, and it's important to build an effort from the bottom up. And so if you can win over the hearts and minds of the engineering teams, it's possible to have them help you prioritize. It makes it a lot easier for you because there are a bunch of people fighting in your corner to make sure this work gets prioritized rather than being the sole person working on this. And so I think I would stress that over-communication is really valuable. This is something that Sasha has helped me learn. You should basically get to a point where you feel like you're the annoying person in the room that everybody doesn't want to see. And I think at that point, you're probably getting to the point where your message is becoming clear and being repeated over and over again. And it's also critical to remember that with all of these teams and stakeholders, if you're not talking about a priority, somebody else will be. And there'll be plenty of people with new products and new ideas and new ways to make new revenue. So it's important to get out and make sure that everybody understands this regularly. And so we do that by attending a weekly dev meeting, attending regular product meetings, and presenting wherever we have the opportunity to do so. We also talk about risks a lot. Those are something that will come up, obviously, constantly. And so you want to get out ahead of those things and develop your plans to mitigate them. So this is not possible as a one-person show, which we attempted for a while, but you need to hire the right people to help you represent these ideas. And so we've hired a great team. It's a small team, but a couple of very enthusiastic guys who help deliver this message and make it clear that these timelines are possible. And like I mentioned before, we thought about planning from a really different perspective as well. We wanted to keep it as lean as possible. We wanted to do enough planning to understand what's going on, but we wanted to stay largely out of the way. We know that the developers that are working through this problem are the closest to the problem. They have the most context, and they can tell us the best way to do these things. And so we wanted to make sure that any process we have for planning was really basically in the background. It was a place to collect information and to understand the progress that we're making. But the process itself does the heavy lifting. It's not tons of spreadsheets and meetings about updates. And we think of ourselves as the team that is sort of the connective tissue between all the other teams. So we wanted to find the right balance of information. What did our stakeholders actually want to know about versus all of these other options that we have available to us for planning? And so we asked, and this is what they wanted. It's deceptively simple, but who is working? How much progress have we made? And then a gigantic counter of how many days left till our deadline. This is published far and wide across the company. Everyone has access to it. And we try to make sure that this is updated. This is actually updated regularly on its own. It's completely automated, but we want to make sure that this is exposed, and so we expose this monthly at our executive stakeholder meeting, as well as, again, at dev meetings and product meetings. A key to this entire process is, Sasha mentioned the cake process earlier for governance approvals. We thought about it the same way for how we do project planning. And so we developed a really simple way with a Jira product roadmap. Each team that's migrating has a ticket. Every week, they record a list that we compiled of things we want to know about. They have a bunch of subtasks for all of the applications that they're migrating, and they just update that ticket. That's the single source of truth across all 22 teams. We know exactly what's happening, provided they provide us the updates. And all of that information is then skimmed and put into our dashboard completely automatically. So this has been really helpful for us. The key being that any decisions that are made are recorded in one place and they're available for everyone to see. So all of these things are great, but change happens regularly. And so we needed a way to also be able to deprioritize work. We know that things can go completely sideways quickly. New privacy regulations can come. Anything can happen. And so that's fine as long as our business agrees that there will be an impact depending on the change that we make, and that everyone agrees on the path forward. We're completely fine with that. So again, we use the Jira project. If a change is announced, it's recorded. We put it in the Jira ticket, and then we have a meeting between all of our stakeholder teams. They make a decision, the prioritization is finalized, and then it's recorded in the Jira ticket, and it's again published for everyone to see. There's no questions about what's going to happen. Everybody's aware of the changes, and everybody understands the impact. So that is to say that things will change for you as well, and I think it's okay. I think as long as you know that that it's going to happen and you're prepared for that, then it shouldn't really be too difficult. And so I actually heard, sorry, I jumped ahead a little bit. So part of this as well is thinking about how we think about our teams and them being prepared for all of the changes that are coming. And so they're going to own their own infrastructure, which is a huge change from when we started. They're going to be responsible for things they weren't before. And so when we think about our process for a new team starting their work, we like to let them spend a bunch of time getting to know the tools, going through training, working with development teams that have already been through this before, and having an opportunity to really understand what's happening with the new technologies that they're going to be using. And so we have to prioritize that time, and we need to invest in all of our teams. And most importantly, this is maybe something that's not talked about that often in project management circles, but we really care about our teams, and we understand that we're asking a lot of them, and that it's people that have their hands on the keyboard every day, and they're the ones making this transformation possible. So we spend a lot of time thanking them for their work, and we make sure that our executive teams, product teams, and engineering teams all recognize this work as well. So a big piece of advice, don't be afraid to break the mold with your projects. We like to party personally. It's such a big project, and it's like an ongoing year-long project. People get very tired and kind of, you know, think about leaving, or maybe they will leave, but we want to make sure that everybody understands the benefit of the work that's being done. And so I want to close with a quote from Kelsey Hightower. Right after we signed, we had a customer meeting that we attended, and he said that we were the only company that he'd ever heard of that threw a massive party for themselves after signing a deal with Google. And so this kind of embodies how we think about this process. Everything that happens is celebrated, and I think the three of us up here are very lucky to be here today representing such a great team at LiveRamp, and I just want to say thank you to all of them for making this possible every day.